Imagine this: a crowded train in occupied Europe, soldiers with rifles at the doors, boots muddy from the front. A loudspeaker crackles with orders no one dares to ignore. Passengers stare at the floor, clutching their bags like lifelines. And somewhere in the middle of that carriage, a young woman adjusts her scarf and pretends to worry about nothing more than the price of bread. Inside the hem of her coat is a strip of silk, hand-stitched to look like a simple repair. In reality, it's a coded message. If the guards search her properly, she disappears. No trial, no mercy, just a file, a number, and a shallow grave. Here's the question that matters more than all the movie myths. If that risk was real, and it was, how many people do you think would still volunteer? We like to imagine we would. We tell ourselves, if I had lived back then, I'd have resisted. I'd have fought. But history isn't made by what people imagine they would do. It's made by the handful who actually said yes. Most stories about the Second World War never even mention them. We are shown tanks, generals, flags, the loud parts. The front line is obvious: trenches, gunfire, maps with arrows sweeping across countries. But there was another front line, one you almost never see. No uniforms, no medals, no marching bands. It moved through markets, train stations, offices, cafes. It ordered coffee, folded laundry, listened politely to drunk officers, while memorizing what they said. It wrote shopping lists that were really codes, and love letters that were really instructions. And very often, that front line had a woman's face. Why don't we hear about them? Because they were designed to be forgotten. The organizations that recruited them operated in the shadows. Their work had to vanish the moment it succeeded. If an operation went well, there was no headline. Just a line in a file: message received, target destroyed. No further action. When the war ended, secrecy didn't. Files stayed locked. The women went home. Some were told never to speak about what they'd done. Others tried and were met with raised eyebrows. You, a spy, don't be ridiculous. So their stories slipped through the cracks of history. Yet, if you pull at those tiny loose threads in the archives, something unsettling appears. Time and again, in occupied cities and remote villages, you find the same pattern. A typical housewife who somehow travels far too often. A nurse whose patients always include the most talkative officers. A secretary whose typewriter produces more than office memos. If the official record says the war was won by men on battlefields, why do these women keep appearing every time you follow the money? The messages, the explosions in the wrong place at the right time. That's the mystery we're going to walk into together. Because behind the tanks and the headlines, the war became a frantic race for information. Armies could no longer move without knowing what waited over the next hill. A single report, one train timetable, one map of a fuel depot could save thousands of lives, or cost them. Every side knew this. So every side built invisible networks to hunt for secrets and to protect their own. And that's where the women came in. In occupied Europe, a man of fighting age, hanging around a rail yard with a notebook, looked suspicious. A young woman with a basket of vegetables did not. A soldier loitering in a hotel lobby might draw questions. A maid changing the sheets in an officer's room was just part of the furniture. The enemy's own stereotypes created blind spots. Someone had to decide whether to exploit them. So somewhere in London, in Algiers, in Cairo, in underground offices with bland names and locked doors, a quiet decision was made. If you wanted to move information through a continent on fire, you needed people the enemy refused to take seriously. Ordinary women were suddenly asked extraordinary questions. Would you be willing to travel under a false name? To memorize codes until they replace your dreams? To let your family believe you're redoing safe office work while you slip into a city where anyone might betray you for a bag of sugar? These weren't hypothetical tests of character. They were forms with real signatures, interviews with real consequences. Say yes, and you stepped into a life where one careless glance at a patrol could end you. Say no, and you had to live with the knowledge that someone else would be sent in your place, if anyone could be found at all. So here's the uncomfortable thing no heroic movie will ask you. If you were 19, or 25, or a single mother in your 30s, if the world was collapsing and someone quietly offered you a one-way ticket into that darkness, would you take it? Or would you tell yourself that staying home was probably more useful anyway, and hope someone braver made the decision you wouldn't? Stay with this thought. Don't run from it, because over the next minutes, as we peel back the layers of this hidden war, every story you hear will be a direct answer to that question. Real women did say yes. They stepped out of the known world and into a game where the rules were written by men who never intended them to play. And once you've heard what they actually did, you may never look at the words ordinary civilian the same way again. Join us as we uncover the forgotten front line. Subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss this hidden chapter of history. Their courage was instrumental in turning the tide of World War II, yet their names are rarely spoken. These are the incredible true stories of the unsung female spies who risked everything for freedom. Recruitment didn't start with a dramatic handshake in a smoky bar. It often started with something that looked boring. A notice on a board asking for people who spoke French, a form in a government office, politely inquiring whether you'd be prepared to serve overseas in special capacities, an interview where the questions were just a little too interested in how you handled fear. Imagine you walk into that room. The man behind the desk has a file with your name on it, but he pretends he doesn't. He smiles like this is routine. Have you traveled? Do you speak other languages? Can you ride a bicycle? Do you have family in occupied territory? Would you be willing to undertake work of an unusual character for the duration of the war? When you hesitate, he notices. When you don't hesitate, he notices even more. Because here's one of the most uncomfortable secrets of this world. They weren't just looking for bravery. They were looking for the right flavor of bravery. Too reckless, and you'd get yourself and everyone around you killed. Too cautious, and you'd freeze when the knock came at the door. Too emotional, and torture might break you. Too cold, and no one in the field would trust you. So they watched the tiny details. Did your hands shake when you lit a cigarette? Did you make eye contact when they mentioned the possibility of rough treatment? When they casually suggested you might be captured and not come back? Did you flinch, or did you quietly lean forward, as if you wanted to know more? What would your body give away? If they liked what they saw, your life changed with a signature. One day you're a clerk, a nurse, a student. The next, you're re-given a train ticket to a place that doesn't appear on any public timetable, and told to tell your friends you've been moved to confidential work that you're not allowed to discuss. You arrive at a country house in the middle of nowhere. From the outside it looks like a retreat for overworked civil servants. Rose bushes, a gravel drive, a polite woman serving tea. Inside, the windows are blacked out and the corridors are full of locked doors. You're told this is just initial assessment. In reality, it's the first filter. They run you through obstacle courses in the rain to see whether you complain. They teach you how to tail someone through a village without being spotted, and then, later that night, you find out that you were the one being tailed the whole time. You're re-given a cover story and dropped in a nearby town with a simple mission. Make contact with a stranger in a crowded cafe without using names, without writing anything down, and without getting followed back. How quickly could you adapt to being someone else? Then the training deepens. Day after day, you learn to dismantle and reassemble weapons with your eyes closed. Even though the official line back home says women shouldn't be anywhere near the front. You practice Morse code until the rhythm invades your dreams. Short, long, every dot and dash another step closer to or away from death. You learn where to plant explosives so a train derails in the most inconvenient way possible. How to hide a wireless aerial in a washing line. How to make a conversation sound harmless while you're actually exchanging times, locations, and targets. All the while, instructors are writing reports about you. Some of those reports are flattering, calm under pressure, quick learner, excellent with codes. Some are not. Too independent, too emotional, unsuitable for fieldwork. And here's the twist. Sometimes unsuitable meant we re-scared. She's so committed, she'll do something we can control. In a world that kept telling women they were fragile, weak, and in need of protection, these files locked away for decades describe them juggling pistols, explosives, and two identities at once. The official culture said they shouldn't fight. The secret culture quietly prepared them to. Which version of the truth would you rather live in? There was one more lesson though, that no amount of shooting practice or fieldcraft could soften. At a certain point in the course, usually late at night, you'd be taken into a small room and walked through, in graphic detail, what capture actually meant. No rescue missions, no prisoner exchanges, no guarantees. You'd be told that your best protection was the enemy, believing you knew less than you actually didn't, that if they realized you were important, they would do everything possible to break you. Then they handed you a form. You had to sign the Official Secrets Act, promising that you would not talk about your work to anyone, ever, without permission. Not now, not during the war, not even after. You had to write a letter home in case of emergency, sealed and stored somewhere you'd never see it again, unless you survived. Imagine writing to your parents, your husband, your children, trying to find words that say goodbye without admitting that's what you're doing. Would your hand shake then? Here's the psychological catch. By the time you reach that moment, you've already been woven into something bigger, friendships forged in training. The sense that you're finally doing something that matters, the quiet knowledge that if you walk away now, someone else less prepared might go instead. Are you really making a free choice? Or are you already too deep inside the machine to step out? Some did walk away. They failed a test, confessed they couldn't face the risk, or simply vanished back into civilian life. We don't remember their names because they weren't recorded as heroes or traitors. They were just deleted from the story. But the ones who stayed moved on to the final stage. They were given new names, new backstories, new personal histories to rehearse until they sounded natural. They practiced their signatures in the identities they would use across the border. They learned which lies to tell if stopped by a patrol and, more importantly, which truths to tell so the lies didn't stand out. At the airfield, waiting beside a darkened plane or a silent black-painted aircraft, the instructors' voices changed. There were fewer jokes, no more bravado, just practical instructions and a last warning. Once you jump, you're on your own. Once you cross that border by night train, there is no safe phone number to call if you panic. Standing there, listening to the engine start up, how many of those women do you think quietly hoped the mission would be cancelled? How many secretly prayed for fog, for mechanical failure, for anything that would postpone the moment they had volunteered for? And yet, mission after mission, they climbed into the aircraft, or onto the boat, or through the checkpoint. They weren't finished products. They were still full of doubt, fear, contradictions, exactly like you, exactly like me. But they went anyway. The question now is, who were they once they landed? What did they actually do when the training ended, and the real streets, the real guards, the real betrayals began? Because that's where the myth of the female spy falls apart and where the real, far more disturbing story starts. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe to uncover more hidden histories. What does it actually look like when the training ends? When the plane door opens, the ground rushes up, and a real city, not a practice village, waits underneath. Let's start with someone who, on paper, should never have been there at all. A young woman sits at a small wooden table in a cramped Paris attic. Outside, the city is quiet in that heavy, unnatural way that only occupied cities know. Inside, a single lamp is dimmed to almost nothing. On the table, a bulky metal radio set, a notepad filled with groups of numbers, and a revolver she hopes she'll never have to touch. Her name is Noor Inayat Khan. Before the war, she wrote children's stories and played the harp. She was shy, gentle, deeply uncomfortable with violence. The last person you'd cast as a spy in any film. And yet here she is, fingers hovering over the Morse key, about to send a message that could change the shape of the underground war in France. Why would a pacifist volunteer to do this? Why would someone who believed in non-violence agree to land in a city where there were no rules? That's the first hinge in Noor's story. She didn't stop being who she was. She brought that same stubborn idealism into a world built on lies and double-crosses. She didn't want revenge. She wanted freedom, and she was prepared to risk her life for it. She presses the key. Short, long, short. Long her coded words raced invisibly across rooftops, through the night, over the channel. Sitting in a dull room in London, a signals officer starts to write them down. Another invisible thread connecting a woman alone in an attic to a vast unseen machine. Every time Noor transmits, a clock starts ticking. Enemy direction-finding vans crisscross the streets below, trying to triangulate her position. The longer she sends, the smaller her safe circle becomes. She has 15 minutes, maybe less, to pour everything important into the ether and vanish. Would you be able to think clearly with that kind of countdown running every time you opened your mouth? Weeks pass. The network around her begins to crumble. One arrest, then another. Safe houses raided. Contacts disappear. One morning Noor wakes up and realizes that many of the people she relied on yesterday may already be in handcuffs or worse. London tells her she can come home. Her job is done. It's too dangerous to stay. This is the second hinge. the moment where every rational instinct screams, "Get out," and she says, "No." She chooses to remain as the last active radio link in a city flooding with secret police and informers. Day after day, she drags that heavy set from one hiding place to another, changing addresses, changing covers, trying to stay always one step ahead of the invisible hunt. Ask yourself honestly, how long before fear would start to erode your resolve? How many nights of listening to unfamiliar footsteps on the stairs below before you convinced yourself it was time to stop? For Noor, the answer was simple and terrifying. There was no time to stop. Someone watched, someone talked. Betrayal in this world rarely announces itself with dramatic music. It's usually just a familiar face making a tiny, fatal decision. One evening, the door opens and it isn't a friend. She is taken, searched, questioned. The radio that made her powerful becomes Exhibit A against her. They want names, signals, codes. She gives them nothing that matters. They move from threats to violence. She still refuses. You'd like to believe you'd hold out to, but how much pain would it take to make you start bargaining with your own values? Noor never really had a dramatic rescue arc. There was no last-minute escape that rewrote the ending. Her story closes in a quiet, brutal way. A transfer, a camp, a gunshot in a grey courtyard. Witnesses say her last word was liberté, not revenge, not a curse, a principle. That's the uncomfortable shape of real heroism. No perfect plan, no Hollywood payoff, just a human being who decides, again and again, to refuse. If you're still here, if your instinct is to say, "I don't know if I could have done that," good. That uncertainty means you're paying attention. Now, let's pull on another thread. Picture a smoky bar in pre-war Europe. A young journalist watches as men in uniforms beat someone in the street outside. Her drink stays untouched, her jaw tightens. In that moment, she quietly chooses sides. Years later, that same woman walks through the back streets of Marseille as if she owns them. Her name is Nancy Wake. The enemy has a reward on her head big enough to buy a small estate. Locals whisper her codename, the White Mouse, because every time the trap seems about to snap shut, she somehow isn't there. Here's the paradox. Nancy loved good food, loud laughter, and expensive clothes. She also blew up trains and organized ambushes. How do you reconcile those two? Maybe you don't. Maybe that's her power. Initially, she used her social position and charm to help people escape downed airmen, hunted resistance fighters, anyone whose face had appeared on a wanted poster. Each success deepened her conviction and increased the risk. When the net closed in, she had to flee across mountains, exhausted and half-starved, chased by men who saw her as a prize. Most people would take that as a sign to stop. I've done enough. Someone else can continue. Instead, Nancy crosses to Britain, walks into the secret world, and effectively says, "Send me back." But this time, with weapons. Fast forward, it's night in central France. A parcel drifts silently from the sky, money, explosives, radios suspended under a parachute. On the ground, resistance fighters scramble to collect it before anyone else can. Nancy is there, organizing, ordering, swearing, forcing chaos into something like a plan. When communications fail, they don't send a man, they send Nancy. She climbs onto a bicycle and pedals. More than 300 kilometers through territory dotted with checkpoints and roadblocks just to restore one radio link. No convoy, no escort, just muscle, will, and a calculation that staying still would be more dangerous than moving fast. Would you have done that journey? Alone, in the dark, knowing every village you cross might hold someone willing to trade your life for leniency? Reports from those days describe her as relentless. She drank hard, fought hard, and expected from others the same courage she demanded from herself. Men who initially doubted her ended up taking orders from her, not because of ideology or some grand speech, but because when the shooting started, she was still moving forward. And yet, after the war, how often did you hear her name at school, compared to the names of male commanders? This is a pattern. Extraordinary women doing work that reshaped the battlefield, then being gently filed away into footnotes. If that makes you uncomfortable, it should. We are taught to celebrate sacrifice, but only when it fits a narrative we already like. Which brings us to a third story, one that forces us to look at what happens after capture, when there is no more running, no more glamour, just a long, slow confrontation with pain. Imagine being handed a ticket that sends you not to a glamorous capital, but deeper into the machinery of repression itself. Odette Sansom, a mother of 3 living in Britain, volunteers to help the secret war almost on a technicality. She offers photographs of the French coast, and someone notices her background. She is sent for training. Like Noor and Nancy, she passes. She is assigned as a courier to a network in southern France, moving messages between contacts like blood through arteries. Her work is quiet and constant. Train journeys with a suitcase that weighs a little too much, meetings in cafes where the clink of coffee cups masks the exchange of coded phrases, endless small decisions that must be right because a single wrong one will kill someone. Then the betrayal. Her story, and so many others, remain untold, hidden in the shadows of history. It's vital we remember them, not just for their courage, but for the truths they teach us about the real cost of freedom. Thanks for watching, and if you want to uncover more stories that have been left in the footnotes, make sure to subscribe. A knock, an arrest. Suddenly the skills that kept her alive on the streets are irrelevant. She and her commanding officer are in custody, transported into a system engineered to erase resistance. Here's the hinge most stories avoid. In that room, under those lights, there is no such thing as a pure hero. Everyone breaks somewhere. The question isn't, will you break cliffs? Where will you channel the damage when you do? Odette is interrogated, threatened, tortured. Her captors want details, names, locations, procedures. She knows that if she speaks freely, whole networks will vanish. So she does something almost suicidal. She drags the attention onto herself. She insists she is in charge. She presents herself as more important than she really is. She claims responsibility for decisions she didn't actually make. I alone was to blame, she repeats, over and over, until they start to believe her. Think about that strategy for a second. Instead of trying to fade into the background, she steps right into the spotlight, hoping to take the full force of whatever comes so others might stay invisible. Would you be capable of that inversion? To deliberately make yourself the single point of failure, knowing exactly what that means for your own body? The months that follow are a blur of prisons, transports, isolation, illness. At any point, she could adjust her story, give them just one name, bargain for slightly better treatment. She doesn't. The price she pays is carved into her for the rest of her life. She survives. Many others don't. After the war, Odette receives medals, ceremonies, recognition. But even then, there are people who quietly question her account. Was it really that bad? Did she exaggerate? Without witnesses, how can we be sure? This is the final twist. Even when women like Odette lived long enough to tell their stories, they sometimes had to fight a second campaign just to be believed. So we have 3 different women. A shy writer who chose a radio over safety. A hard-drinking, sharp-tongued partisan who turned charm into a weapon. A mother who volunteered and ended up carrying blame on purpose. Different personalities, different motives, different fates. What connects them isn't a stereotype of female intuition or feminine wiles. It is something far more dangerous. The decision to walk straight into a role that society had never really written for them, and to hold that position even when the cost became unbearable. As you sit here, safe, watching this on a screen, you might feel an uncomfortable question forming. If the next great crisis demanded people who were willing to do the same, step into danger, accept anonymity, carry secrets they could never unload, would we have enough Noors, Nancys, and Odettes left in us? Or have we become so used to visible credit, instant validation and public applause that we no longer know how to value the kind of courage that leaves no trace but a line in an old file and a name on a forgotten memorial? If that question stings even a little, don't click away, because in the next moments we're going to pull back from individual stories and look at the larger pattern. They expose the web of small, hidden acts that quietly bent the course of the war, and the long shadow their absence still casts over how we talk about heroism today. When you zoom out from the individual stories of World War II, something strange happens. The war map you were taught in school with its arrows, dates, and famous generals starts to look incomplete. It's as if there's a second layer printed in invisible ink. On the surface, history tells us a major offensive succeeded, because a certain number of troops landed on a specific beach at a specific hour. It sounds clean, linear, and satisfying. But if you follow the threads back from that beach, through the countryside, into the towns and villages behind enemy lines, you keep bumping into people like Noor Inayat Khan, Nancy Wake, and Odette Sansom, hundreds of others whose names never made it into the textbooks. Somewhere, weeks earlier, a woman who looked like a simple housewife, carrying a shopping basket, took the same train 3 days in a row. She wasn't shopping. She was noting which carriages were marked for fuel, which for ammunition, and which for troops. She passed that vital information to a courier, who memorized it, burned the paper, and then pedaled through the dead of night. That courier met a wireless operator who turned those observations into a coded series of numbers and sent them crackling over the airwaves. Back in London, an anonymous officer looked at those numbers and quietly changed the timing of a bombing run, or the target of a sabotage operation, or even the date of an entire invasion window. Officially, the record will later state, attack postponed due to updated intelligence, but unofficially, the real reason is a woman whose neighbors just thought she was preoccupied with groceries. How many updated intelligence notes do you think are really just that, whispers carried by people no one ever thought to notice? Now, think about the terror on the other side. Imagine you're an officer tasked with keeping a critical rail line open. On paper, everything is secure. Troops patrol the stations, IDs are checked, and curfews are strictly enforced. Yet somehow, trains keep derailing at precisely the wrong moment. Telegraph wires fail just before important messages can be sent. Bridges that looked solid yesterday are simply gone this morning. Who are you fighting? You see the soldiers at the front, but the real, crippling damage seems to come from ghosts. Those ghosts had names. They were the young woman who studied how long it took for repair crews to arrive, and timed her explosions accordingly. They were the typist who read every single report that crossed her desk and quietly copied the ones that mattered most before filing them away. They were the cafe owner's daughter who decided which customers got real coffee and which got watered-down brew, based on whether their conversation was worth listening to. None of this looks spectacular in isolation. A small delay here, a missing supply wagon there, a whispered rumor about troop transfers repeated in just the right ear. But wars aren't just decided by big, cinematic moments on the battlefield. They're redecided by friction, 1,000 tiny resistances that slow one side down and speed the other side up. If victory is a machine, these women were the grains of sand dropped into its gears at exactly the right time. And yet, when the war ended, when the medals were handed out and the official stories were written, how were they described? Support staff, auxiliaries, helpers. Do you feel the immense gap between that label and the reality of what they did? Part of the reason is structural. Intelligence work, by its very nature, is designed to be deniable. The best operations leave almost no trace. The strongest networks collapse into silence as soon as they're no longer needed. It's safer that way for the agents, for their families, and for the countries that might one day want to pretend they never had to play quite so dirty. But part of the reason is also psychological. Societies have preferred stories, heroic narratives they like to tell themselves. It's as much cleaner to picture wars as contests between uniformed armies than to admit how much truly depended on people who didn't fit the traditional image of a warrior at all. It's far easier to say, the army won, than to admit, the army won partly, because a civilian, a person nobody saw, took a risk she never had to take. This brings us to an uncomfortable question hidden inside all of this. If these women's work had failed, would they have been blamed more loudly than they were praised in victory? Their courage was instrumental, yet their names are rarely spoken. It's time we brought their incredible true stories out of the shadows and into the light. Thanks for watching. Follow 4 more stories from the invisible ink of history. Or would they simply have been forgotten faster? Because that's the final cruelty of this kind of work. When it succeeds, it leaves barely a ripple. When it fails, it leaves a crater with a name carved into it. Which brings us to now. To you, sitting wherever you are, watching this on a device that would have looked like science fiction to the people we just talked about. Why are we digging into their world at all? It's tempting to say, because it's inspiring, and leave it at that. But if you've stayed with this story all the way here, you already know that's not enough. These women's lives aren't tidy motivational posters. Their stories are messy, painful, sometimes unfair. They weren't all saints. They argued with their handlers. They made bad calls. Some trusted people they shouldn't. Some had to live with the knowledge that a decision they made led directly to someone else's arrest. So why pull them back into the light? Because the way we remember a war is also the way we define courage. If we only remember the obvious heroes, the ones in uniforms on parade, we quietly teach ourselves that bravery belongs to a specific type of person. Male, visible, decorated. Everyone else is just background. But what if the most decisive acts were made by people no one was meant to notice? A woman who kept her expression steady as soldiers searched her luggage. A courier who didn't tea break when she realized the person across the table knew more than they should. A radio operator who sent one last message anyway, knowing every key press tightened the noose. Does it make you uncomfortable to imagine that the balance of whole campaigns might have hinged on someone who, in peacetime, would have been dismissed as just a girl in a shop, just a mother, just a secretary? It should, because once you accept that, you have to ask a second, sharper question. If something this big could depend on people that invisible, what else in our history have we misread because we were only looking at the loudest figures? It's easy to comfort ourselves with the idea that the system will always provide the right heroes at the right time, that institutions will train them, send them, honor them properly afterwards. But the stories you've just heard hint at something else. Often, the system was late, reluctant, or flat-out hostile. These women had to push against their own societies just to be allowed to risk their lives for them. And that might be the most disturbing lesson of all. If another crisis came, not a copy-paste of the last war, but something messy and new, do you honestly believe we'd automatically recognize and value the people we most needed? Or would we once again underestimate them until it was almost too late? Maybe that's why these files are opening now. Not because someone suddenly discovered girl power 80 years too late, but because the world is finally just mature enough to face the fact that its legends were edited. Look at how we live today. We swim in information. Surveillance is a word we use casually. Intelligence sounds cold and technical. Satellites, algorithms, cyber this, cyber that. It's easy to forget that at the base of every system there is still a human decision. Someone has to choose to press send. Someone has to choose not to look away. Someone has to decide that their fear matters less than what might happen if they stay silent. The women Uwe met in this story made that choice without knowing how it would turn out, without assurances that anyone would ever know their names, and often in direct contradiction to what their own cultures told them they were meant to be. You don't have to like war to respect that. You, Dan T., have to romanticize violence to recognize that there is a kind of courage that doesn't fit neatly into any of the boxes we were given as kids. So here, the question that's going to stick in your head long after this video ends, whether you want it to or not. If history, 80 years from now, dug into our time the way we've just dug into theirs, would it find you among the safe majority? Or among the tiny number of people who quietly did the right thing when it was brutally inconvenient? You don't need to answer that out loud, but if you feel even a small sting when you hear it, that's the part of you that understands exactly why these women matter. They prove that you don't have to fit the stereotype to change the outcome. You don't have to be the strongest, the loudest, the one at the front of the parade. Sometimes the person who makes the difference is the one who walks through the crowd unnoticed, carrying a message nobody else could or would carry. And here's the unsettling twist. You will never fully know how many lives they saved. Neither will I, neither did they. That's the nature of invisible work. Its impact is real, but its shape is impossible to measure. What we can do is refuse to let their stories disappear a second time. That's what this space is for. Most channels will keep giving you the same recycled battles, the same speeches, the same 5 names you've already heard 100 times. Here, we're going to continue hunting for the people behind the curtain. The agents, saboteurs, and reluctant heroes whose fingerprints are all over the outcome, even when the history books pretended they weren't there. We're going into the failed missions, the bad decisions, the moral gray zones. We'll look at the operations that went wrong as much as the ones that went right. We'll ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, betrayal, and what happens to people when the war ends but the secrets don't. If you've watched this far, you already know this isn't background noise. Something in you wants the unedited version, so don't leave it here. You know exactly how this works. There are 1,000 things competing for your attention that will try to drag you away in the next 10 seconds. If you want more of these hidden stories, you're going to have to make a choice, as deliberate as the ones they made, much smaller in scale, but still a choice. You can click away, file this under interesting and let it dissolve in the algorithm. Or you can stay in this world a little longer. Subscribe, so you don't lose the trail. Hit the notifications if you actually want to know when the next case file opens. And if there's someone you know who still thinks all the heroes wore uniforms and marched in straight lines, send this to them and let these women argue otherwise. Because the secret war didn't just happen then, it's happening now, in different forms, in different places, in the choices ordinary people make that no one else ever sees. The women of this story walked into the dark, without any guarantee that the light would follow. The least we can do is look back long enough to see them clearly, and then ask ourselves, quietly and honestly, when it's our turn to choose between comfort and courage, which side of that invisible line are we going to stand on?